So I'm not going to give you a whole spiel. I'm Brian. I'm our director of practices. Micah. He's our practice manager over our scripted practice. I'm going to talk to you about upgrading from AngularJS to using NnUpgrade.
Yep.
And there you go. He's got a lot of stuff, so I'm not going to take any more time.
Okay. So yeah, as Brian said, my name's Micah Wood. I've been with STG for 4.5 years now, and I feel like the majority of it has been living in the Angular world. So started doing AngularJS a few years ago, which led into another AngularJS job, which led into some Angular work. And lately I've been dealing with taking large-scale AngularJS applications and trying to get them into a place that can be migrated to Angular. So real quick, before we get started, how many here are currently using AngularJS? Perfect.
Nobody's using AngularJS?
This is the right crowd. And then, so what's everybody using right now? Are mostly React, Vue, Angular?
React.
Oh no. Okay. That's fine. We're gonna have fun anyway. Yeah. So I recently just finished teaching a semester of Ruby to first-year computer science students. So if everyone just looks completely disinterested, I'll feel much more at home with some public speaking. So don't feel bad if you're just zoning out.
Way to handle the crowd, Micah.
Yeah, exactly. So
Nice job so far.
I'm going to make everybody feel good because you are a React developer, so you're not going to have to deal with anything that I'm going to teach. So first off, why upgrade? Any opinions out there? That's fine. I got some stuff to say. There's a few good reasons. AngularJS end of life was announced. That was 3 years away. So you think, well, I'll switch jobs like 3 times between now and then. But if everybody does that, then you're going to end up in the same place, just at a completely different company. So essentially, that's when they stopped releasing security fixes. So after June, it's only got 30 days. So July 1st, 2021, if there's a 0-day vulnerability, too bad. So you've got some time to decide, do we go to Angular? Do we go to something else? If we're going to be rewriting, sky's the limit. Maybe a new framework comes out between now and then. You can roll those dice if you want to. One nice thing about going the Angular route is you get much better performance. So it's faster to start up. The change detection is significantly quicker. If anyone's familiar with kind of the digest cycle with AngularJS, if you ever dabbled with it in the past, it's basically a giant array of everything that could change in your entire application everywhere. So if one thing changed, it would go through the whole array and see if everything else needed to be updated. Pretty slow. Angular moved away from that and has better performance because of it. There's a lot of new features that Angular provides. There's some kind of native support for them. So things like TypeScript. If you're not using TypeScript, I highly recommend it. The first time I had my editor tell me that what I was doing wasn't going to work, instead of having to put debugs and console logs everywhere, was just a joy. So if you go to Angular, you get TypeScript out of the box. The Angular CLI is a really nice tool to handle all of those annoying kind of build processes, so you don't have to mess around with grunt and gulp tasks. It's just behind the scenes, it's using Webpack, but it's set up to deal with how Angular expects things to be positioned. And then there's some other things, RxJS, NGRX. NGRX is like a Redux store. There's a whole bunch of other options with Angular. So if you decide to go from AngularJS to Angular, you get much easier access to a bunch of these things. So that brings us to NnUpgrade. So the issue is a lot of companies have large AngularJS projects. They're split across multiple teams. There's no way that you can handle a rewrite entirely. No business owner is going to sign off on months of no work being done just to make it look exactly the same, but slightly different. So NnUpgrade was developed by the Angular team to handle this use case. So So what it does is it lets you bootstrap an AngularJS and an Angular application side by side. You can kind of migrate everything piece by piece, and you can then write new functionality in Angular, so you're not making more work for yourself in the future. So to give kind of a high-level overview of how this could work, so here's an AngularJS template. It's just looping over some items, displaying a name and description for them, and it's got this like button on it. AngularJS doesn't care what like button is. It doesn't care if it's an AngularJS thing. If it knows about it, it will render it. If it's something else, it's just going to treat it like a div, and then whatever is responsible for rendering it can. So for example, some people actually do mix React and AngularJS, which I wouldn't recommend, but you can do it. So that could technically be a React component, it could be a Vue component, it could be a native web component, anything you want it to be. It doesn't care. So because it's kind of unopinionated in that sense, that's where NnUpgrade comes in, because it basically says, assume like button at this point is an Angular component, then Angular handles rendering that. Don't worry, we'll dive into it a bit more later. So here's just real high level overview of what's going on. Don't worry too much about it. But basically, ng zone is kind of the new digest cycle. It's much more broken up by components rather than being application wide. And so what this is showing is that when you use NnUpgrade, it hooks up the Angular root scope.apply or the digest loop to an ng zone. So it's an Angular application. Everything's running using Angular's change detection. It's just hooked into AngularJS's change detection. One caveat of that is set timeout and set interval. If you guys did anything with AngularJS, you may have noticed that it recommended that you use $timeout or $interval. And what that was basically a way of hooking up these timeouts into AngularJS's digest cycle, because it was, yeah, so if you were to use set timeout or set interval, it would happen outside of the digest cycle, so you wouldn't have to worry about any performance issues. So a lot of places will use these knowing that they run outside of the digest cycle because they don't want it to slow down performance. So if you had like long polling, some kind of window scroll event, anything that you wanted to happen quickly, you would use these. So one thing to be on the lookout for is if you were using these for those reasons, once you set up NnUpgrade, they're now going to be used, they're now going to be hooked into the event lifecycle. So just one thing to be aware of. You guys don't have to worry about that though, because you're not dealing with it. The other thing that NnUpgrade does is it links the two injectors. So with AngularJS applications, you just had one single global injector. So that's where it would get access to all of your services, directives, filters, components. Basically anything was just in one global thing. Angular has a much more kind of like a hierarchy tree approach where there's still a root injector, but you can have multiple modules or components, each with their own injectors. So what's going on here is NnUpgrade is just setting up the link between these two injectors so that it can look, so it knows, okay, I don't have it. If Angular says I don't have this in my root injector, I'm going to check $injector on the AngularJS side and vice versa. So that's what allows you to, without having to rewrite components, you can still use them in either context. So let's go ahead and get started with actually implementing some of these things. So if you're kind of lost at this point, that is to be expected. It's a bit of a, it can be problematic. So I got really used to staring at this, the 7 stages of grief, while I was going through my upgrade. I would say 90% of my time was spent in bargaining, just trying to get it to work, switching things around. It's very nuanced. There's a lot of gaps in documentation. It's changed a bunch of times. So documentation from a blog that you found that's 6 months old, you think this is great? Nope, it's outdated. The upgrade process has improved, but you kind of have to deal with that. So one thing to keep in mind is don't be hard on yourself or your team as you're going through this process, because when AngularJS was new, everyone was using Bower. Bower was great. It was better than checking in all of your third-party libraries into source code. But now Bower even says don't use Bower. It says use Yarn, Webpack, NPM, anything but us. Likewise, everyone thought that, let's see if this loads. Everyone thought that Yeoman was great, and the grunt file that it generated for you that was about 1,000 lines that you were sure that you were going to read at some point in time was just the greatest thing in the world. And you didn't have to write any of this, but you didn't have. But if something broke, good luck figuring it out. So these are things that you're going to come face to face with and get really annoyed with while you're dealing with your upgrade. So that's why I say it was good at the time. Things have improved. So now we can actually kind of begin the initial setup. So it starts real simple. Just install an NPM package like you always do at Angular/upgrade. But it already starts out complicated because we've got a decision to make. Do we go the upgrade module route or do we go the downgrade module route? They're very different, and we'll kind of give some overviews of the two. So the upgrade module, it's the most common approach. So the nice thing about that is there's going to be a lot of information online about it. You won't have to figure things out as much. Basically, the way this goes is how I've been describing it the whole time. It's a single application. It's an Angular application that just happens to be running AngularJS. And so everything runs inside ng-zone, like we showed in the back in a previous slide. So downgrade module, nobody really talks about it. There's hardly any documentation about it. Change detection is kept separate. So at this point, you're basically having two separate applications. And so it's, if you find yourself in a situation where that seems better, it's available. We're not going to talk about it because nobody really uses it. There are some performance gains because the change detections are kept separate. So it's not one thing having to check two applications. So there's some preparations that the Angular team recommends you go through before starting this process. Your mileage will definitely vary on this because what I found is a lot of these preparations feel like you're doing two migrations. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So the first thing they recommend is get away from Bower, migrate to NPM. There's going to be a lot of problems with that. Mainly, a lot of the Bower dependencies that you're using will not exist on NPM. So the first way you can try getting around it is referencing a get URL directly, which NPM allows you to do. You can even reference tags if you wanted to. The problem is that I've come across is a lot of these Git repos for Bower packages never even used NPM to begin with, and it requires that there's a package JSON in the repo. So if they don't have it, you're out of luck. You can't use it this way. At that point, you've got to fork it, set up your own private repo, do whatever you want. So kind of a pain. As far as pains go, minimal. We'll get into the more painful stuff. Next thing they recommend is refactor everything to follow the style guide. If you've worked on any large-scale AngularJS applications, you'll find that people learn as they go. And so there's going to be old code that was clearly designed by somebody that was learning AngularJS at the time. You'll see $q.defer everywhere, despite the fact that most things create native promises anyway. And so the first thing they do is say, follow the style guide that came out a couple of years into AngularJS's life. So this does give you some really nice benefits. It recommends one component per file. So in this case, a lot of times people will have like a controller.js and they will put 100 controllers in that one file, and then they'll have their directives.js likewise. If you're going to be splitting it up piece by piece, it helps to have everything in a single file. And that's what Angular recommends going forward with the new framework. The next thing it recommends is use folders for features. So instead of having your controllers folder, your services folder, and everything just crammed in there, it gets hard to know, okay, where can I safely break things out? So by having feature folders, so if you had like an admin section, you could have an admin folder, and inside of that, you could have user management, account access, break it up that way. So then when you're looking at the code, just at the folder structure, you can go, okay, I'm going to tackle the user management migration at this point. And then the next thing it recommends is migrating directives to AngularJS components. It's a new thing that was added in AngularJS 1.5. And so those map much more easily to the Angular components. It also recommends just setting up a module loader. So if you're not familiar with those, they're things like Webpack, Browserify, and System.js. So instead of having a grunt file that just concatenates all of your JS files, you use the node modules. So you import and export. So you basically have a root module that imports everything it needs. And then you point one of these things at that root module, and it can follow the imports and exports and bundle all of your files for you. You don't have to explicitly say every JS file. And then the last thing it says is migrate to TypeScript. And this can be as simple as just renaming all of your JS files to be .ts. So that's just a shell command that does that. But it suggests taking it one step further and actually converting them to be TypeScript components. So actually adding typings, using classes, all this fun stuff. This is why I said it feels like you're doing two migrations. I tried this out on a couple services, and it took half of a day to just rewrite existing code in TypeScript. And at the end of the day, you still have AngularJS services. So not ideal if you've got a time constraint. So what I've kind of recommended lately is the no preparations route of handling the migration. So that's ignoring everything, taking your app as is, and just trying to make it work. So the first thing you do is, using the Angular CLI, create an application. We'll call this hybrid app. We'll give it routing. And then this creates a folder with its own Git. It initializes a new Git repo. So let's delete that Git repo so that we can actually migrate everything over, including our existing Git changes. We don't want to lose our history. Next thing we do is create a folder to just dump the entire Angular 1 application into. And this is optional. If you want to keep it clean and separate, you can create a new folder to put all of the Angular 2+ stuff into, or you can just keep it in source app. It's kind of up to you. So the next thing is, if you do move all of your Angular stuff into that ng2 folder, the only thing you have to update is the main TS file, because your app module's in a new location. And so here is the part that is basically just copy things over and make it work. Every application is different. You're going to deal with every unique decision that your application made. You're going to have to deal with at this point, because you're trying to make it work in a new environment. So if you've got a less compilation process that outputs multiple CSS files, that's going to be an issue. The CLI doesn't support that. If you need multiple JS files to be built, that's going to be an issue. If you've got a bunch of broken images that you didn't care about because who cares? Webpack's going to complain about that because it likes to know where things are. Which brings us back to the 7 stages of grief. At this point, it's just going to be anger, denial. It's the whole shebang. So yeah, less in Sass, kind of talked about it a little bit. Angular CLI supports both of them to begin with. It has a default entry point that you can change if you want. But if you've got an existing kind of main lesser Sass file, you can just import it in this guy, and then you're good to go. And then you can also add additional entry points in the Angular CLI configuration file. Scripts can also be added. So say you've got 1,000 JS files from your Angular JS application. One thing you could do, if you're crazy, is just dump them into an array in the configuration file, list them all out. It will automatically concatenate everything for you. It doesn't support globs, so you have to actually list every single file. But it concatenates them for you, so that's one build process that you don't have to deal with. If you are already using ES6 modules in your code, then you can just import it into your main app, and Webpack will traverse that tree and import everything for you. So then there's the asset folder. This guy is where you want to put any of your, I'm blanking on the word, so I'm going to read my slides. That's not the word I want. Static assets. There we go. Anything like images, translation files, basically anything that just needs to be referenced directly somewhere in code, whether HTML, CSS. You just put that in the asset folder that the CLI creates for you, and it's automatically available when you serve your application and when you build it. It just copies them over exactly as they exist. It also has some configuration options. So this does support globs. So you don't, so say you've got some Bower component, some Bower dependency that has assets that you want to include. This basically just will include them in the root of your application. Likewise, if you don't want everything to be assets / whatever, you can change the output of any of these. And then a little teaser, you'll notice that we're referencing a .temp directory. We'll see one possible use case for that.
So there you're still using Bower.
Yeah. So this is kind of the no preparations route. So you're just throwing everything in and hoping it works. By this point, you've probably noticed that no preparations has had a lot of preparations. So I added an asterisk. Problem solved. So yeah, back to the assets. There's that temp folder. So that will allow you to do things like reference your vendor.js and app.js. If you guys are familiar with kind of the Yeoman generated thing, that's the defaults it would go with. Third-party scripts all get concatenated into vendor, and likewise, your application goes into app.js. And so because it's that temp directory is being output to the root, this is assuming that there's a scripts folder in that temp directory. So let's say you've tried to make it work as much as you can with the CLI, but your build process is just too unique. It's not going to work. It's not Angular, it's not JavaScript if you don't come up with a overly convoluted way of accomplishing simple tasks. So we're going to create kind of a Rube Goldberg machine. So one option is the command ng-eject. What that does is that secret Webpack behind the scenes that the CLI is using, it gives it to you. It says it's yours now. And you can, if you know Webpack, you can just go to town on that, make it work however you want. I don't know Webpack, so I kind of struggled with it. Another option is, let's say you take your grunt or your gulp task that is already working for you, and you just make it work with the CLI. So say, for example, you've got your gulp tasks, and they do concatenation, minification, and spit it out somewhere in the temp directory, and then it probably starts up a server, runs your unit tests, all of those things. You can set it up so that you get something that's kind of like this. So your grunt or your gulp jobs will handle all of those, and instead of dealing with serving the application, it just dumps it in that temp directory. The CLI has that temp directory registered as an asset, so that means it's watching it for changes. Anytime there's a change, it triggers live reload. Likewise, if you run a build, it's just going to copy everything there directly into the build bundles. So this is just kind of a real rudimentary drawing of the flow. And so the CLI still handles TypeScript compilation, unit testing of Angular, serving and building. And some of the stuff that's a pain to migrate now, but won't be an issue once you're fully migrated, can still just remain handled by grunt and gulp. So yeah, not a fun setup. Now we'll take a step away from some of these decisions we have to make and look at the must-dos. There's not many of them. So the first thing is, most people are bootstrapping their Angular applications this way. You just throw ng-app somewhere on an HTML element, and it starts up your application for you. That's not going to work in a hybrid app, so you just remove it. And you insert this line somewhere else. This is just how you manually bootstrap an Angular JS application. So right now it's being appended to the body, and then it's loading the some app module. Where this goes, however, is going to be another decision. And here's where we'll do kind of a deep dive into some of the possible ways you can handle this. So yeah, you're probably starting to feel overwhelmed about all of these decisions you have to make and all of the setup you have to do. I did warn you that this was going to be a problem. So to kind of help everybody feel better, here's a quick montage of baby animals. We've got some kittens, a little baby monkey chewing the leaf with his tongue sticking out if you're close enough. And my personal favorite, a baby giraffe being fed by a giant bottle. So now we're going to be looking into actual strategies of working with the upgrade module specifically, because we're not going to deal with the downgrade module. So the first way you can go about handling your upgrade is having kind of an Angular JS root to your application. So you're still bootstrapping it through an Angular application, but everything still exists in your index.html file like you're used to. Whoops. So here's some of the pros and cons. I'm real bad at coming up with pros and cons, so yeah. The main thing is it's really easy to set up. This is, if you look at the Angular documentation, this is the route that it assumes, which means the nice thing about that is everything that they say will work, works. There's a few drawbacks. It assumes you're dealing with the Angular JS router for the lifetime of your upgrade. So that means that anything that is any route that has an Angular component as the entry point needs to be downgraded. And you're kind of limited in the approach you take. You tackle upgrades because you're still dealing with one router that's handled by Angular JS. It can also be slower to start out because you don't have as well-defined of a strategy for handling it. So you kind of pick the approach I recommend is starting with the leaves and then and anything that kind of any shared components and working your way up from there. But it can be slow to start out because you're going to be dealing with a lot of touch points between the two frameworks. So let's give kind of a brief demo of how to actually set this up so we're not talking so much hypothetical. So now, bear with me while I change which screen I share. All right. Okay. So here is just a standard Angular module. Can everyone see that okay, or should I bump up the font size a little bit more? Let's bump it up a bit more. It's easy enough. Nobody wants to admit that they're blind. Okay. So right now we've just got a standard Angular module. And right now it's not doing anything. So if we look at the index.html, you can see we've got our ngView, which is the Angular JS router outlet, still in the index.html. And most likely, this would be a lot more complicated. You'd probably have some kind of app header and a number of other components here. Let's say total container. Kind of get the idea. The way Angular JS applications are structured, the index.html is kind of the root application, and everything lives there and then gets handled elsewhere. But doesn't complain because those don't exist. We'll delete them. So first thing we need to do is, you'll notice we don't have ng-app anywhere. So what we want to do is set up the upgrading. And so right now we're just pulling in the upgrade module. It also needs to be imported into the module so that everything can be hooked up. And the way that it recommends the way that Angular recommends it is you set up this ng-do bootstrap callback hook, and this is where you do your upgrade, and we want it to be on the body. Oh, whoops, this dot upgrade bootstrap. Okay, and to kind of show you guys some of the file structure. So here we've got our ng1 folder. Everything's TypeScript just to make it easier for the demo. And it's a poorly, you can see nothing is split into multiple files. It's just kind of all crammed in here. So we've got a few routes. You can see the root route is going to pull up this app root component. And then we've got a component and a controller. Then over on the Angular side, we've got this app root. So app root is actually going to be a downgraded Angular component. And right now it's just got some basic content in it. And then, so the concept of upgrading and downgrading things we'll be going into more in depth. Here's just kind of a preview. So here is a example of some downgraded components. So what's going on here is we're pulling in the AngularJS app module. And the nice thing is it's kind of a global variable. You can just attach more things onto it as you need. So this exists completely outside of all of the AngularJS source files. You can just create it as a file somewhere else in your code base and pull things in. Even if you're dealing with JavaScript files, because Angular.module is global, you can just reference it with this file having no idea what's going on. It just is accessing strings. So you can see here, we've got our app root and we're downgrading it. So what that means is AngularJS knows about it. It can grab it from its injector and display it on the page. So start it up. And as you can see, it doesn't work because I forgot something. AngularJS is not, oh yeah. Let me track down you, there we go. So it's complaining AngularJS is not loaded because it is not a, when you import it as TypeScript, it encapsulates it in a closure, so it's not a global, variable. So the upgrade module provides the set Angular lib function, which just makes it global, or at least makes it so the upgrade module can get a handle to it. If you're just pulling it in without using TypeScript imports, then you don't have to worry about that. So there we go. Now everything's working. You can see we've got some routes here. The not nice thing is the root route renders the app root template, and that has these links on it. So when we navigate to one of them, we go to a new route, we're no longer displaying app root, and we lose our links. So the easy workaround would be keep everything in the index HTML. But that's just kind of a quick example of getting the two applications running side by side, just using the AngularJS router. ngView exists on the index.html. You'll notice if we try and use ngView inside of the app root, going to break. So I'm going to spend some time showing you something that doesn't work. Now we can click on it. You can see the URL changes, but ngView down under here, nothing happens. It expects ngView has to exist at the time that the AngularJS part is bootstrapped. So that's what's going on here. Is AppRoot doesn't exist until after the bootstrap has taken place, so it doesn't know about ngView to wire it up. So that's why when you go this approach, you have to stick to using just the AngularJS router. So back to the slides. Yeah, so as I had mentioned, there's kind of limited options for how you handle your upgrades. So this is kind of a crude drawing of one way that you could go about it. So you can't split your routes because everything's just an AngularJS route. So the easiest way to go about doing it this way is to look at kind of the leaves or shared components. So instead of dealing with one of these root components and all of the complexity of all of the things that it has to interact with, you know that this guy down here interacts with nobody, so you upgrade him. And this guy's used by a few people, but it doesn't depend on anything else, so you upgrade that one as well. And then you just kind of work your way up. Next, you deal with the things that work with the things that you have already upgraded, and just keep going and going. And then at the end, you've got an Angular application. So that's kind of the only way to go if you go that route for the upgrade. There's another option called sibling routes. And so what that does is it gives you two routers. So now you've got your Angular router outlet and your AngularJS outlet. It's got some other pros and cons. One of the main pros would be this allows for lazy loading. So the new Angular router makes it super easy to do lazy loading, which basically means you've got a bunch of code that only is used on specific routes. There's no point in loading it in that main bundle. It just slows down your entire application. So you can split it up based on functionality so that it's not until somebody actually goes to the part of the application that needs to use it, then it loads all of those assets. So the nice thing is you can actually put the AngularJS upgrade module and bootstrapping part in a lazy loaded module. So then you don't have to deal with all of the costs of loading AngularJS until you actually navigate to a part of your application that uses it. So this allows us to actually handle upgrades by route rather than by components. So you can look at a piece of functionality and say, perfect, I'm just going to take this away. I'm not going to have to deal with other teams because this is my functionality, this is my route, and handle the upgrade yourself. You don't have to deal with any of that cross-team coordination. One con, it requires bootstrapping both frameworks. It doesn't throw an error, but they have said that it's kind of an anti-pattern, but it's the only way to get it to work. And the Angular routes are considered straight Angular applications, which means they don't have access to upgraded components. So your only option at that point is to actually rewrite any components that you would need to upgrade. So you basically have to do it as, it's kind of like rewriting the entire feature all at once rather than piece by piece. And then there's less documentation, and a lot of the documentation for it is lacking. So we'll do kind of a quick demo of sibling routes. And in the interest of time, let's just jump. Oops. Jump to a branch that already has it. Okay, so if you look at some stuff. So if we look, we can see we've got the router outlet and then the ngView. There's a little bit of styling to make it easier to see the two. Angular is going to be outlined in red, AngularJS outlined in blue. So we've got our two outlets. If we go to our app module, you'll notice we're no longer using ngDo bootstrap. We're actually using the bootstrap property in the module to start up the app component. So just like the AngularJS router needs to be aware of the outlet when it's created, the Angular router needs to be bootstrapped with a component. And so to get it to work, you've got to do this bootstrap. So then where do you actually go about bootstrapping AngularJS? Great question, I hear you ask. There's a couple options. The most straightforward is you just move it inside of the app. So now you can think of the app component as your old index of HTML. It's the shell of your application. So yeah, on init, it just bootstraps your AngularJS application. Everything else is the same. And now if we serve this guy, now you'll notice we've got our AngularJS routes. So they're rendering in the blue, in the blue, in the blue, and now in the red. So this route is being handled by Angular. There's going to be an issue with this where you've got two routers sharing a single resource, being the route. So they don't communicate with each other at all. So you have to deal with handling the making sure that it doesn't render two things at the same time. So there's a few ways you can go about doing that. The easiest way that I'll show is right here. So let's add some spacing. So if we go to the ng2 route, which you can see we're at right here, it's going to display that component, which we've got as the ng2 component. This one's not downgraded, it just exists as it is. Any other route that it doesn't know about, it's going to render this empty component. And all that is just a completely blank template. And then likewise, if we go to our AngularJS routes, when we're on the root route, we don't display anything because that's handled by the app root. That's just rendered by default. It's not tied to any route. When we go to any of these, we display some AngularJS components. Otherwise, so this is kind of that catch-all route. If it's not one of these explicitly listed routes, it displays nothing. So that way, if either router is aware of it, it's going to render something. If it's not aware, it renders nothing and hopes that the other one will. So there is the potential that you go to a route that was handled by some weird 404 logic, and you get nothing to display now because neither router is aware. So it's something you've got to deal with. The other thing, as I'd mentioned, any Angular routes need to be completely isolated. They need to only be Angular. They can use upgraded services, but they can't use upgraded components. So if we look, we've got, oh no, this one I wanted to create myself. So if we look, we've got this to-do component. It's real clever. It does nothing. So here's how you upgrade components. So we would make a new directive. And I've got a snippet for it. So here's what we're doing. So we're giving it the same selector that it has in the AngularJS side of things. So they share the same thing. The other part is we call, since this is extending a component that comes from the upgrade module, we're able to call super on it. So what we're doing is we're passing in the string that's going to be used on the AngularJS side to grab this component. We're passing in the element that this directive exists on, and we're passing it the Angular injector so it can grab whatever it needs. So what this is doing is basically creating a hook. So if you use that selector anywhere in your code, it will just hook into the AngularJS component and render that. In order to make it work, we've got to come in here and register it. Looks like it's already registered, actually. So now we've got this upgraded AngularJS component. So we haven't written any new code in Angular. We're just referencing it. However, if we go into this ng2 component and try to use it, so here's how it looks when AngularJS renders it. Oh, you can see we've already gotten an error. And if we try and access the Angular route, it's going to break. So it's kind of hard to see. The error is that it can't access the scope. So every injector is available in your Angular routes except for $scope. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out a workaround, but couldn't come up with any. And it kind of makes sense if you're going the sibling route approach, it makes sense to just treat each route as Angular only. The nice thing is new functionality, you can just write straight Angular. You don't have to deal with any of this upgrading and downgrading. It's only the people that are suckers and have to deal with the actual migration from AngularJS to Angular that will have to deal with it. So that's the main benefit, is you can have separate routes, and new code doesn't have to deal with it. Old code will, and you can't intermingle your routes. Let's see. So here's kind of an example of how you would go about handling an upgrade using this scenario. So what you would do is you would isolate a section and you would say, okay, I'm going to handle upgrading this route. You'll notice that was a shared component, but because you can't upgrade that component to work with AngularJS, you've got to just migrate that one entirely. So at the moment, those are two components that are the same thing, existing in different frameworks. So one catch, you've got to manage both of them. And now you just upgrade this entire route as is. And then you're done with that. Oh, I didn't upload a picture. There was another picture. I boxed off the other one, did the same, but I think you get the idea. Thankfully, services are so much easier than components because they're just singleton objects. They exist once, and you can use them anywhere. So we don't have to spend anywhere near as much time going over services. I can tell everybody is happy about that. So here's an example of how you go about downgrading a service. So in this situation, you've got a service that exists in Angular. You need to use it somewhere in AngularJS. All you do is create a factory. You give it a string key. Oops, I can't highlight that. Yeah, you give it a string key, and then you call that downgrade injectable function, which comes from the upgrade module, and pass it in the actual service class that you've created. Those names don't have to be the same. It could be completely different. And then you would, when someone injects your downgrade service in an AngularJS component, it looks just like every other service. You just reference it with the string key, and then you've got access to it in your controller, directive, component, other service, whatever you need. Because AngularJS knows that if someone's trying to get to a service tied to that string, it just calls that function, which returns that class. And then upgrading services is easy as well. It looks a little scary because of that. But what you do is you've got your AngularJS service, and it has a string to get access to it from the injector. And all you're doing is hooking it up to your service providers in your Angular module. So in this case, we've got, snooze is dead. So in this case, you've got a service that we're calling title case. And in this instance, you do want to make sure that this string is the string that's being used on the AngularJS service when it was created. And so all it does is you give it a factory function where you pass in the $injector. And so it just fetches it directly out of the $injector, the AngularJS injector. And then at that point, you can use it in any of your Angular components or Angular services. The one catch is because Angular dependency injection expects types. It does support strings, but you have to use that inject annotation. And so at this point, we're just that's going to call that factory function, which is going to get that service from the AngularJS injector. And then at that point, you can use it anywhere you want on the Angular side of things. Whew. I'm going to take a drink, and any questions? There's a lot of material. You guys made it through 77 slides. Yep, so going this route, so services are super easy to upgrade as well. So I haven't used this one as much, just because for the most part, a factory function, or if you're using the AngularJS service, you've already got a class and you can almost copy and paste it verbatim. But yeah, in the event that you do have an AngularJS service that has yet to be upgraded, you just create, all you have to do on the Angular side of things is add this to the providers array in your module. And then it can be used anywhere. And this one, and services work both upgrading and downgrading regardless of which strategy you go with. So if you go the sibling routes, this works fine. If you go the AngularJS root route, this also works. Yeah, any other questions? Awesome. Well,
Mike, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
The NnUpgrade, this feel of this process on the whole would be able to use it to also convert like React components over to Angular if you want to do that for some reason. I don't know if that's.
No, it's, yeah, the upgrade module specifically handles the linking of AngularJS and Angular. So all of the behind the scenes things that the framework does for you, it links them so they're both aware of what's going on. Yeah, so it's not going to deal with, let's test my React knowledge. What's it called when you call set state? No, not transclusion. Nope, I'm blanking. But there's a term. Yeah, it's the diff that happens when you call set state in React. It's a separate thing. The upgrade module doesn't know what's going on there. It doesn't hook into it. But great question. Any others? All right. Yeah. Steve.
So you mentioned obviously this is a very involved process, right?
Mhm.
You know, switching something of this magnitude isn't going to be easy. What would you say was kind of the hardest part, and what were some of your strategies to kind of deal with that while still meeting the needs of the release cycle and features and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, the hardest part is definitely getting your old app to build in the new, because that's where you run into that's where all the nuance comes in. So yeah, you've got years of build systems that are expecting things to be packaged in a specific way, or business decisions that led to, like, if you still support IE8, you need to split your CSS. So you've got to deal with all of these little things that the CLI is not equipped to handle, because it's just dealing with browsers that are supported now. Microsoft doesn't support IE8, so they don't either. So that's where, yeah, that's kind of where all of my time spent bargaining was. Just make it work, I'll be happy. And so, yeah, once you get that part set up and going, then it's much easier, because then you can actually start the process of migrating code. Yeah. Brian is busy. Yeah, so if you've got a smaller application that could be upgraded in a couple sprints, I would recommend trying to just do all of it at once rather than setting this up. This really comes into play when you've got one of those applications that multiple teams are dealing with, and you can't stop development, but you don't want to be making more work for yourself in the future. Yeah, because whether you go AngularJS to React, Vue, some new thing that hasn't come out yet, or Angular, it's going to be a rewrite, and then it's just a matter of how you do it. Yeah.
Do you find that you face a problem with scoping the variables?
Scoping the variables? Oh, yeah, actually, sometimes that's a good one. Yeah, so if your Angular JS is using a lot of global variables, that can be another problem, because if you're bundling it with a module bundler like Webpack, everything's going to be in closures and isolated. So yeah, that's where, like, as you're learning JavaScript when you're writing Angular JS and you're making all sorts of wrong decisions, they're all going to come back to bite you during this process. Great question. I didn't know Ron knew that much about JavaScript.
Yeah, thank you. What you prefer? What method is you prefer?
Lately, I've been used. The last one I did was sibling routes, and the main benefit of that was so that any new development could be done completely in Angular and not have to deal with upgrades and downgrades. Yeah, because the other route's nice because it's easy to set up, but then everything you're doing deals with downgrading Angular components to work with the Angular JS router and potentially upgrading components and services as you're going through in a much more fine-grained approach. So it depends. Yeah, I like the sibling route just because it's easier for me to think of it as a function, a feature at a time.
Yeah, that seems like that. We're not putting another choice.
Yeah, especially when you have to deal with other teams, because then you have to bug them and be like, oh, hey, this is now an Angular component, and you need to change the way you pass in inputs. You got to wrap them in square brackets now. Have fun updating all of them. Squeeze it into the sprint because you're blocking me. Yeah, that can be a pain. So yeah, Brian?
It was a loaded question. It would have been one of the better asked at the start.
Oh, okay.
I just wondered if a lot of people maybe weren't doing NnUpgrade because it was that hopeful, we're going to rewrite that application. We're not going to upgrade it. We'll rewrite it with more functionality and something else down the road. And it's one of those things that just live on in legacy.
Yeah. And that's been a lot of the people I've discussed it with have gone that approach where it's going to have to be rewritten. And yeah, they're dealing with all of the maintenance issues with it. And so they don't want to risk accidentally copying over a lot of the mistakes that they made the first time. So in some instances, they feel like it's easier to start with a clean slate than to try and do this porting process. Yep, it's one now.
I wanted to thank everybody for coming. Micah will be hanging a little bit longer if you guys have some more questions you want to. But thanks everybody. We'll let you guys get back because it is getting to be 1 o'clock and we don't want to take you any longer than. Thanks everyone.
I guess I have one quick question. No clapping. Since everybody here, since everybody here does React, are you feeling like you made the right choice? Are you happy with React at this point?
It's not a loaded question.
It's not loaded.
That's a vote of confidence when they're all silent.
I've been doing Angular for like 4 years now, and I still really like it. I did Ember before that, but yeah, it's a pain. But anytime you got to deal with migrations, it's still a pain. So hopefully React doesn't rewrite their entire framework.
I do have a loaded question.
Perfect.
Did a lot of you move from Angular JS to React because you didn't want to go the upgrade path, or the route of Angular's model? React seems, I see it, and it's my own observation, but I see a lot of people that like Angular JS or some of the flexibility that Angular JS had, more JavaScript, less TypeScript, less structure, are migrating to React either consciously or subconsciously. Would any of you say you fit in that boat? Or just React seemed neat, so I chose React. A little bit of both.
Basically, I was just approached one day by my boss, like, so we're pretty much converting from Perl to React. I'm going to React.
From Perl to React? Whoa.
Yeah.
That's a big switch.
Oh, yeah.
It's like,
Yeah. That's like from amphibian to mammal or something. Actually, that is a good metaphor because two worlds.
We're all out of the ocean.
Thank you, everybody. Great, thanks, Micah.
Thanks, guys.